So, welcome to Staging Eastman, a symposium hosted by the School of Fine Art, History of Art and Cultural Studies and the Schools of Music as part of a Sadler seminar series called Tunings of the World. And this is really the heart of this Staging Eastman project, which is a multimodal investigation of the extraordinary Julius Eastman, which included a concert of our students and the performers Elaine Mitchell and Anton Lukashevich at Opera North last weekend, an installation of the Otolith Group's third part of the third measure in our school's project space, and today's symposium, Staging Eastman. So it's very important for us to when looking at a figure like Eastman and various connected issues and work of an audiovisual nature, that we actually theorize and kind of analyze works in different ways. And as I was mentioning in some of the text beforehand, it's very important to have that opportunity to experience the work. And there's a pedagogical aspect of this as well, with our students and staff being able to work with Elaine and Anton in the realization of the music, and also in the mounting of what is an ambitious and extremely extraordinary film and video installation. So without further ado, Staging Eastman is really looking at the idea of why one should mount such a project at this time in this place. And now, as intimated in the text accompanying this event, staging brings to mind like the stages of a rocket kind of firing off and propulsing itself into the future, but equally, like, things are jettisoned off. There's kind of explosions along the way, and it's not necessarily a straightforward kind of journey. So we're not professing that this is going to be the first event of its kind, but if you look back, whether it's Eastman's own famous statement at Northwestern in 1980, or Unjust Malay's CD recording in 2005-ish, around then, or the London Contemporary Music Festival's performance of Eastman in 2016. There are these moments kind of globally where, not in a kind of theological sense, but in a kind of like a kind of accumulation of different kind of ways of thinking about this material, and further kind of resonances and I suppose kind of explosions to take on the inflammatory aspect of some of Eastman's work. So we're thinking about what is it, why now, why, and particularly in Yorkshire and the UK with its own kind of specificities, and also for students, most of which are hearing, playing, experiencing Eastman for the first time. What are the kind of resonances for them? And then I should also map out some of the kind of more psychoanalytical registers of the stage, about playing something where we can kind of start to destabilize some of the kind of established ideas of what it is to be human, like the ontology of the work, and then also the idea of actually mounting the work in particular ways, whether that's a concert, a audiovisual installation, or symposium such like this. And maybe there isn't one singular mode which is the most appropriate for this kind of hermeneutic activity, but you have to kind of go through all of these different approaches, and I suppose that's going to kind of inflect the conversation today, I hope. And we've got a mixture of thinkers, writers, performers, and of course Angelica and Kojo from the Otolith Group, who are going to be there constantly, in the wing mirror, and their kind of installation is going to be a constant point of reference. And for those who are able in Yorkshire, I really compel you to come to the school and see it. It's on till 5 p.m. tomorrow, and it really is something that should be felt in real life, in installation if possible. So just to kind of start off, I've been rediscovering again your amazing essay, Isaac, on Eastman, the sonority of blackness otherwise, and there was something that really struck me in relationship to thinking about Staging Eastman, in terms of I suppose the idea of movement, and I suppose, you know, you early on in the essay you pick up this idea of like a kind of almost like a history of blackness being a history of movement, flight, kind of gesture, kind of a lack of fixity. And you also mention the idea of Eastman as a figure, as a kind of Renaissance figure that was difficult to almost be, I am a composer, or I am kind of this one particular kind of thing. And I'm sure there's going to be resonances for Elena later on when we start to talk about being, you know, a figure that is performing, composing, making visual artworks. But for now, I just wanted to kind of pick up on this idea. You draw on the work of Glisson, this kind of errantry. And that, you know, I've been doing my own homework and trying to catch up on some of those references, but thinking about this idea of there being a kind of a journey that's kind of your experience, and I suppose, you know, phenomenologically and kind of, you know, philosophically, things are mobile and in a movement, and you have to kind of take that on board. And I suppose I wanted to kind of, you know, tee you up to maybe talk about you know, your own journey with Eastman, and thinking about Eastman as a non kind of static figure, and a figure that we're evolving in terms of relationship with, and I suppose how it's resonating, and how it's kind of actually being picked up by us and others.
Thanks very much, and I'll just say thank you to the organizers, Ed and Sam, for this lovely invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be here alongside Kojo, Angelica, and Elaine. I'm Isaac Jean-Francois. I'm a grad student at Yale University's Department of African American and American Studies. Though I'm not a musicologist, capital M, I love the lowercase m designation. And I often flirt with questions of sound after Amiri Baraka in The Way of Things. The opportunity to speak with you all today about Eastman and be in conversation is really, really special. So you brought up, Sam, a really curious point in one of my own wanderings with kind of Afro-diasporic philosophical archive that I wanted to position, or have been positioning, adjacent to questions about Eastman and his aesthetic production. And Edward Glissant's term from Poetics of Relation, errantry. And it's not the way that I understood it, and specifically engaging with Eastman's frame. It's not a purposeless wandering that sort of escapes a linear trajectory, or is in search of belonging or home, but the ways in which a kind of processual, ongoing path that is taking all different kinds of steps and turns can refuse the call to fit in one box, move on one line, sing one song. And that is what I think Eastman offers for us, largely in his work and presence as a culture worker, but more explicitly in his piece, which some of you may be familiar with, The Composer as Weakling. The idea that for the composer to be present in this music aesthetic space, that he or she, they, And he plays with pronouns in this piece, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about questions of embodiment and gender in his larger frame, but have to be a total musician. Now, this obviously smells a lot like the concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. And I am still thinking about how Eastman is engaging that reference rather explicitly. But the idea that a Black gay man in his period would be insisting upon every single dynamic of aesthetic production, choreography, dance, performance, singing, composition, conducting. It's clear that he was demonstrating to us, to listeners at the time, but to us as people who are grasping at the kind of waves in the pond, so to speak, that are continuing to reverberate, that we must think beyond the authorized categories of what these different practices of aesthetic productions can be, and how if we can, watch something with an eye towards listening, as the otolith groups invites us to do, watching in the key of listening, and we should definitely talk about that as well. What does that look like? What does it feel like? What kinds of questions of desire do they ask of us? And how ultimately does that ferment a different kind of approach to the aesthetic object? So that I'll start there and invite Kojo and Angelica and Elaine to jump in too, if you have comments on that front, on errantry.
Maybe Elaine, would you like to?
Thank you, and thanks to Sam and Ed for organising this and inviting me to share some of my expertise and experience with the students last week in Leeds, which was great fun and an illuminating experience. And I'm going to start with the illuminating experience of performing Eastman and engaging with the work of Julius Eastman, and trying to tie in what Alexandra has just said, because Eastman never gives he doesn't give easy entry points into his sound world, into his philosophy. You have to work. And you have to work at releasing yourself and your ego. There's a thing about being a composer, and Julius Eastman would have known this because he interpreted the work of other composers. So there is a surrendering of yourself as the performer or the interpreter of the work. In order to completely do that, you have to, one has to find it's an entry point and a way of engaging with the sound world, with the aesthetics, with the ideas of that composer. Easier when they're alive, very hard when they have passed on and haven't left many notes. And in order to do that and to completely release yourself and to be, it is a struggle. You carry what you know, what you've been taught, and then someone like Julius Eastman presents you with musical ideas which challenges what you thought you understood or what you knew. And it's this interesting aspect of breaking down in order to be able to present and to communicate that person's musical ideas. And I was writing some notes about sound, and I was thinking about Eastman's early inspirations and early experiences as a chorister in the Anglican faith. So he would have been familiar with biblical texts and references. And I wrote down, in the beginning was the word. And I wrote sound and utterance and the body and the physicality of sound and the physicality of listening and the work and the effort to do that. And it's a physical effort. It's not a passive thing. So working with Eastman, he will not allow you to be passive. It's a very active engagement. And I think if we were to talk to the students who performed last week, they would probably agree with me that you cannot sit back with Eastman. You have to fully engage. It is a 100%. This is what I think he means by the total musician, about embodying each aspect so that you can then be that conduit and communicate your own ideas as a composer or composer performer, or the ideas of someone else. And the act of doing that is ultimately liberating. And there's this incredible energy that comes with that freedom. And I take this background, which is the light bulb moment. When you allow that to happen, that's when the light bulb, that's the illumination of the experience of performing Eastman and engaging with his musical ideas. But that takes work, and it also takes time. It's taken me a long time to get to that point. But each time I go back, I learn something. The light bulb flicks on again, and I'm taken to another level of experience with his work.
Elaine, since I've been kind of aware of your work and following your career, you've been increasingly interested and engaged in I suppose movement, choreography, and your collaborations with Dan Van, and I noticed recollecting your contribution for the Savvy Contemporary project. Was it the nude voice, the naked voice? But where you said something interesting, that it was deliberately slow, but also perpetually moving. And you made a connection between that and Eastman's work. Does that kind of connect to some of the things you're saying about there's a necessarily kind of bodily choreographic way you have to engage with this work?
Well, for me, yes, personally, but it's not something that everyone's able to do or wants to do. And it makes complete sense for me to incorporate movement or choreographic elements into the performances that I do, or even when I read the instructions in, say, Colours, where he's directing the vocalist to move around the space. Now, most singers, most classically trained performers, musicians, are unused to doing that. They're used to moving, but when they're playing their instrument, or they have to, I guess, classical opera singers are staged and they're directed through space. But what Eastman does is challenges these notions of how you present a choral work as such, and a vocal ensemble piece. Normally, you stand and you present the work, and of course you might sway or whatever if you're kind of into the music, but he's asking for something else. And it's also the sound, that it's also carrying the sound through space, which changes the auditory experience for those who are watching. And that's what he's doing, because he's working on a multi-dimensional way. And other composers will have been exploring that, but what he's also asking vocalists who may or may not, we don't know, may or may not have had experience of using what is an extended vocal technique or improvising with their voices, he's also asking them to do very unusual things vocally. And again, if you're coming from a particular training, particularly if it's classical singing, you are not asked to do that. You're not expected to, outside of early music, Baroque music, perhaps, you're not expected expected to improvise. Maybe in bel canto, and even then you are learning an extemporization from another artist. You're not expected to be able to do this on the spur of the moment. So what I love about his work is how he's asking for this. There's this attention that comes from that, because when you work with musicians who are not used to improvising, it's terrifying. It's asking them to engage with something that we did as children, always making things up, making up our own sounds, making sounds, skipping around, moving, engaging with that, which we somewhere along the line, it generally happens around being a teenager, you lose that side of you. And he's asking adults to re-engage with that, to realize the work. And if it's not part of your practice, it really is quite a terrifying experience. But it is ultimately a liberating one. And so for my own things, for me, it's not a problem because it's what I do, but I love the tension that it brings to me and also to those who are observing and experiencing the work.
I just wanted to...
Yeah, pardon. This is the beauty of having a composer performer with us, and I think that the bel canto reference, unsure, was super generative for me, at least, because that requires you to have some kind of canon of already accepted performance scenes for work, or already accepted ways of articulating a phrase. And Eastman is insisting upon, as you're saying, Elaine, the kind of ephemerality and intimacy nestled within each performer in a scene, but also each performer as they gather together in the concert space or space of the recording, which is to say, you're not going to go see, I've seen Feminine a handful of times. Each different time it is another iteration. This is the kind of unmooring that Eastman not only invites, but it makes as a condition of playing his work. And I really appreciate it, Elaine, that you're sharing that with us all.
Thank you.
I just wanted to push a little bit more, Elaine, on this idea of, in terms of what Isaac mentions in his essay on Eastman about the idea, I suppose, the stasis of Eastman being a composer or being a whatever. Like, I think you're a brilliant person to speak to in terms of that idea of your own kind of finding your own place within, these kind of ghettos of various things, of whether it's new music or being a Black performer or composer or visual artist. And I think when you hear those kind of reflections about Eastman, how does that make you feel in terms of your own kind of journey in terms of the discipline?
I'm grateful and thankful because the circumstances within which he was composing and performing and presenting was much harder, much more challenging than it is for me now. So he paved the way for artists like myself who's interested in this area of performance practice to be able to engage in it. But what he does do, though, what he has done is set down that challenge, because I'm very aware that each, as Alexandra just said, each performance of feminine should be different, and that's what it should be. But that each performance of any work should be different. It's not preserved in aspic, and it's about liberating the score and bringing it to life. That's the role of any performer, and that's what I think, and that's what Julius Eastman exemplified and knew, which is what he was putting into his work. And I think having that knowledge of how he was as a performer really helps with one to engage with the way he composed himself. It's very different to the works that he was asked to perform and present. And after a while, he got bored with performing other people's works, which you do, because it doesn't, the challenges aren't there anymore. So, he's not going to do a tour. He'll tour he toured for a certain length of time, and he said, no, I'm done with that. I need to find a way of expressing the ideas that I have in my head and find a means to do this for myself. And as someone who performs, to make that decision to then focus on performing and composing, it's a really huge leap, because in the world of classical music, contemporary new music, you're not really, it's slightly different now, but you weren't back then, you weren't expected to do both. And as a gay Black man, well, those expectations were low, and those opportunities wouldn't have been forthcoming. But I take the energy of that and the kind of resilience and the pushback. I use that energy to help spur me on. And apologies, Isaac. Keep calling you Alex. Sorry. I don't know if Kojo or Anjali or anyone else wants to.
Yeah, I can jump in if you like.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Isaac. When you started speaking, Isaac, I just wrote down a bunch of stuff which I'd like to sort of, which could sort of maybe begin to kind of outline some of the, thoughts behind not just this work, but the kind of ideas behind, or let's say, behind the practice as such of ours, which kind of, I think this idea of some of the things that you were saying, Isaac, really struck me in relation to talking about this kind of processual path, or moving across multiple lines. We've been thinking a lot about temporality, and recently with different talks we've been doing in a program of platforms of thinking we're doing around Octavia Butler, and called the Department of Xenogenesis. And we've been thinking, and also our exhibitions, but we've been thinking a lot about, in all of our work, the essayistic kind of draws upon thinking around time. And as a way to kind of unmoor people from linearity. And this kind of idea of being tethered, being pulled back into the past, into a prescribed future. And the opposite to that, which is kind of to be in this modern condition of being untethered and yet being represented or being treated as tethered. In this condition of relating to maybe Saidiya's work in when she talked about the afterlives of slavery. I was thinking about Eastman in relation to what you were saying, Isaac, in relation to his kind of aesthetic production, wanting to be in control of every aspect of the work, and to control and explore and inhabit all of the different aspects of aesthetic production. And it kind of reminds me of people like Tagore, or Prince even, or James Brown, or even someone like Charlie Chaplin, and in this desire to basically, I think deal with this absence, maybe Charlie Chaplin and James Brown aren't such a good, example, but when you think about Tagore, like as somebody who's a choreographer, a musician, Rabindranath Tagore as a singer, as a playwright, as a novelist, and as somebody who wanted to get everybody involved in sort of like, let's say, temporarily deprogramming themselves from colonization and from the British rule. The aesthetics of decolonization is something that we are very interested in. This kind of relationship between the aesthetics of decolonization for us, I think, involves a sort of form of generative alienation, in that we want the work to almost amplify, let's say, what I feel Eastman is already doing. He is, he's not going to self-police himself in a condition where policing is going on the campus, clearly, in relation to the third part of the third measure, when we perform, when we ask Elaine and Dante to, let's say, sandwich the composition between two performances of Eastman defending the title of the work. He amplifies that term, the N-word, with this kind of desire to sort of almost generatively alienate and produce a kind of counter-agnosia. So I think this kind of way of, for me, this way that one, if you're going to approach Eastman as a filmmaker, you want the camera to work with the sound. You're listening in the key, you're watching in the key of listening, as such. Then the camera has to, like, let's say, produce a dynamic that is amplifying some of these feelings and ideas and politics that I think are in Eastman's thinking.
Can I just pick up on a couple of those things in terms of relationship to temporality, but also watching in the key of listening, because I think that, I think within Eastman's work, obviously time, we can't see time, but it's felt through its effects, so I think things like, the metronomic pulsing or the ostinati of Evelyn, or stay on it, these things that are kind of tenuously, like, just holding, but like also could fall apart any time. And I think as a time-based medium, I think there's something about, like, putting a camera onto these things that opens up a space for the, I suppose, the instability or the insecurity of time, or the metric kind of aspects of the music and the structures, to be exposed. I mean, is that something? I know you guys have made a lot of films, but particularly in terms of this subject matter, I'd like just to talk a little bit more about that kind of thing of letting the camera roll, on these kind of on these time-based musics that are often in the score, like, specifically prescribed their length and their tempi, so even they obviously incorporate improvisation space, but there is I suppose, an incessant reminder of the passing of time within this work, that I think is really important to take up.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that point, Sam, and thank you for the points that Anjali and Isaac and Elaine have brought up. I think, for those of you who don't know, third part of the third measure it's filmed in a recording studio. So there are 3 cameras and there are 6 takes. So there are 6 takes of 4 performers. And then there are 6 takes with 3 cameras. So that's 18 takes. So one take, Zubin, who's doing the count up, Zubin makes one mistake. So we can't use that take. So, so we use, I think, take 5, but we use 17 visual takes. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing 17 visual takes synchronized to one sonic take. So exactly. So it's a question of temporal compression. and temporal programming in the way Anjali's talking about. So you're getting a kind of impossible experience. You know, it's quite far from sitting at the London Contemporary Music Festival, watching 4 musicians play this composition. That was an overwhelming experience when, after years of listening to Eastman on CD or YouTube or through speakers at home, years of listening domestically, there you find yourself with people in an audience somewhere in West London, listening to these compositions. But you know, you have 3 cameras. The cameras can get much closer than humans can. You have cameras with long distance lenses, and you have one camera that is moving around. And when you have these 17 takes, have been they're being subjected to what the pianists play. So, you know, after a while, you start to think that the pianists are the directors and the cameras are the performers. You know, because the cameras are, the idea is very much for the cameras to be at the service of the music.
It's not like it's not a straightforward kind of voyeurism.
Well, in a way it is, yes, because in a way you have these insights into performers that you wouldn't have in a live performance. But in a way, the performances are composited and composed across the takes. So when we talk about watching in the key of listening, what we're talking about is a version of what Brent Hayes Edwards calls hearing across media. And I think this is actually a tendency in other works we've made, such as People to Be Resembling, or a video we made on the work of the recently deceased poet Atel Adnan. And this notion of hearing across media, in his great book Epistrophes, Brent Hayes Edwards says, you know, what if this is one of the marks of innovation in Black art? This notion of working on one medium in the shape or in the shadow of another medium. Like, that's one of the marks. So in that book, he's analyzing, you know, the writings of Louis Armstrong, of Sun Ra, of Mary Lou Williams, of Cecil Taylor, these composers who write. And then his point is, what is the criticism that can hear how composers hear across the writing they do? And that's something that exercises us, that we think about a lot. How can we hear music within and across the images of music? So the idea is that there is no soundtrack. There is no sound image hierarchy in which the sound serves or is at the service of the image. You know, there is no soundtrack that is secondary or that underscores the image. It's the other way around. Mm-hmm. The image is animated through and through by what it is the pianists are doing, and what the pianists are doing is animated by the score. As they perform, each performance is taking longer because they're getting tired, and those kinds of demands are what we're trying to sensitize. So the work is not a documentary, it's some kind of it's some kind of videographic composition, which is in a duet with the performance. It's some kind of duet between cameras, performers, and editors.
I thought this is a good moment to bring you in, John, because I think this is really speaking to some of the work you're trying to do about, you know, about theory and the kind of essayistic quality of kind of attunement. Yeah, I mean, this must resonate with you strongly, John, some of Kojo's comments there. You're on mute.
How appropriate. I'm trying to speak while muted. No, I was listening with fascination to this whole line of reflection on time and temporality. I mean, I am interested in this problem of what it means to, I don't know if it's here, but it's some kind of perceptual activity across media. In other words, exactly what line is being crossed and how is it that the crossing of these lines among media, you know, doesn't simply abolish or efface the differences. That idea of a cross, I find very suggestive. And I have been thinking about it in relation to, as you've just said, Sam, the problem of the essay as a way to think about how the human subject crosses from a space of experience to a space of inscription. And that crossing strikes me as related to what it is that we're trying to get to here in thinking along with Brent about this issue of hearing across. I'm hesitating about hearing because I very much like the formulation of, it's really watching in the key of listening. Listening is the important term there. In other words, it's not looking in the key of hearing. There's a stress there on very particular ways to name what kind of experiential moment we're seeking to underline and capture. So I'm fascinated with those kinds of problems. And as I will bring up in the second part of the symposium, I'm fascinated with the issues that arise in our thinking about how we, in this medium of dialogue, engage with these performances. We're crossing something there too. And I'm interested in how this term that I'm using, not necessarily essay, but attune, how we attune to these differences that we're trying both to observe, recognize, but then also override. So I'm listening very attentively to everything that people are saying along these lines. The other thing I just wanted to say about temporality as such, and I thought that Kojo's description of the actual process of producing this was very rich, because what's happening in this kind of recording is that time is being started and stopped. It's being remounted and reordered. And every time we listen, we are listening to a compression of heterogeneous times. Do they end up really overcoming the sort of basic philosophical distinction between internal time consciousness and chronological time? That's a great question. And I feel like we need to be careful when we start talking about temporalities and the complications of it, because we've raised the stakes very, very high there, it seems to me. I get the idea that we want to problematize the the dictatorship of the chronometer and the sense of time passing in a particular direction, and one intimately keyed to human perception. And I find that those kinds of questions are not only intriguing sort of in and of themselves, but insofar as they are raised by this work of art and these artistic practices, they become an extremely challenging set of questions about precisely something I feel Isaac has put his finger on, namely in what, sonorities of blackness. Now, what are we saying there, especially when we're talking about time and the perception of these kinds of compressed, multiply directed modes of time that we access through these devices of recording and whatnot. And I just put my card on the table. I mean, I do think that when you write an essay, you are inscribing time. You are inscribing language, you are inscribing perception, you are inscribing a relation to the world. And I like to think about that as a kind of tuning to the world. Now, I guess I would like to sort of throw back a question. I would like to hear a little bit more about what kind of work in this discussion Isaac's concept of otherwise is doing. It feels very rich, very evocative to me. It reaches past a lot of the things that we're sort of working with to get ourselves rolling. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, Isaac, but it seems like such a provocative formulation there, because it's got that sense of alterity, it's got that sense of wisdom, it's got that sense of, knowing, a knowing way. All kinds of fascinating issues arise. So I'm just going to throw that down.
No, this is super helpful for me to hear. And I think the question of sonority, now that it's very special to hear a concept reworked again and again and again. Watching in the key of listening has been a phrase, a call to action, a motivating energy that I've been thinking about for, years. And it has really challenged me to think about aesthetic production on canvas, in photograph, in film, in really generative ways. And so to hear it again, and Kojo, as you're putting it here, adjacent to hearing across media, not necessarily that one, and I'm thinking here with the work of Tina Camp, not necessarily that one perceptual encounter is picked up and brought into another scene, but how each is tinged or inflected by, I walk up to a Jasper Johns enamel, I want to touch. In fact, I'm actually touching. It's wrapped up in this strange, perverse, desirous encounter where I want to draw out and extract, but in fact, the piece refuses that. I offer that aside just to kind of approach this scene of the otherwise and pardon the digression there. And in the piece, I start out wanting to really run the abject line. I really wanted to sit with Eastman as the kind of Kristeva power of horror example par excellence. And it wasn't jiving with me, particularly because, and this is something that I'm exploring more, there's something very prior to this position of alterity that I find Eastman naming. What I mean by that, plainly put, the idea of a kind of pastiche, violent caricature of Blackness is not anything new to the classical music scene. Go to Poulenc, go to Satie, go to Powell. You're going to find these scenes. And so for us to arrive at Eastman's composition and place so much onus on his work to do this shocking, outrageous, provocative work of crafting the scene. Well, actually, in fact, I think Eastman, as Elaine was alluding to earlier, has, and through his wild wandering in different compositional, in different performance endeavors, Thomas Morley, Wagner, Strauss, you know, he was playing it all. This was in his ear. We have to get at the different kinds of adjacent subjectivities and wanderings that are not necessarily positioned outside the very necessary for the present scene of production as the abject promises in my reading of that dynamic. It's a frame that I find incredibly helpful, but I offer it to just offer a kind of constellation of terms here. Alterity, as you said, John, really helpful there. Otherwise, and objection are sort of thinking about our position. What are the latent texts and energies that are informing the energy of the piece or the thrust of these compositions? And I'll just close there. And I saw that, Ed, you had your hand up as well. That there are many pieces that Eastman explores that really push against the limits of this hearing across media. Work that comes immediately to mind is Mackle, which I mean, is it once a you know, I could expect it to be displayed alongside Kara Walker's works on paper. You know, it's a gorgeously kind of liquid box of different scribbles and indecipherable words, but we keep being asked to draw and look more. That's just a total visual encounter before we get to the dynamic choreography and vocal expertise required to play the piece and interpret the piece. So I hope that's helpful. Wandering response, but more questions.
Did you have your hand up? Is it still pertinent?
Yeah, if I can, just briefly. I'm hoping here just to quickly stage perhaps a bit of a conversation between Isaac and Elaine. And I just want to preface it with two things. Because there's a line in your essay on Eastman, Isaac, that relates to what you've just said, and that I think is it's really interesting and resonant for me and for this project, I think. When John gave his presentation that opened this whole series of seminars, one of the things that he drew on was the question of not world harmony, but of world dissonance, or thinking of dissonance in that sense. And there's a line where you ask to think about dissonance in the context of what makes a listener register the abject status of the composer. And the thing that's partly in the back of my mind here is Nina St. Eitzheim's The Race of Sound, where she's talking about the listener producing vocality and producing vocal timbre. So there's something in the nexus of those. And I guess the thing that I want to stage between you in that thought and Elaine is perhaps looking back to last Saturday and the performance that we had, or indeed many other experiences that Elaine's had of performing this work, is to what extent do you feel the listener or a relationship to the space, that this encounter that is being staged, as producing something of the vocality and that is colored, shaded, using they're very loaded words, by Eastman's work in this sense.
Yeah, you know, this is really curious, and I immediately want to go to one of the from the last conversation at the talk at Columbia. Angelica had offered that there is a very intentional focus in the otolith group to have women behind the camera. And this idea that there can be intentional ways of disrupting the normative filmic scene of production, that this is a way in which, you know, we were in the conversation before with Kojo, is it a voyeurism of the camera kind of peering into this layering. I often go to the image of baklava here, like the layering, fine layers of the camera, of the screen, as we take one bite. What are the different strategies that the collective offers us to think about intervening upon that normative dynamic? The listener producing the vocality, and I definitely would defer to Elaine on this front, but I think that, and forgive me if this is too sociological, I think that we ask a lot of the body of the performer to do work that is both out of time, necessarily so by ways in which questions of race, sexuality, orientation towards these topics are iteratively shifting, and importantly so. When we ask the body, the flesh of a performer to do the work of show us the way, diversify our scene of production so we can all get back to playing Schubert, we lose sight of the types of invitation that Elaine was talking about earlier, that this is not a kind of aesthetic production that is jiving with the same, but authorizing what I would say an otherwise account of sound's possibility, which is, I think, as Eastman would like it, though I would never assume his intentions, which is super threatening to us, because we all probably have our seasons passes to Dvorak's whatever, but it invites and it excites some really, really beautiful hearings across media. Seriously, hearings across media. So I'll just pass it to Elaine there. And I wonder if we could talk about Sweet Tooth. I know that I love the piece so much, and I just feel like it's one place in which the composer, the performer who's with us is doing this kind of work, doing this kind of intervention. Excuse me.
Well, do you want to say anything more about Sweet Tooth before I launch it?
I just the body. This is the kind of ways in which the body is drawn onto the stage as part of the voice, not just containing the chords and is emerging from the, you know, there's a different kind of physicality that I'm wondering if it's a part of that kind of intervention. That's sort of what I'm asking.
Okay. Throughout this conversation, I kept thinking of another artist whose work I've also performed, but whose life and practice kind of mirrors a bit of Eastman's, not as tragic an end, but I draw a lot of inspiration from her. That's Jeannie Lee, who was also an extraordinary improviser, mainly known in the much more left field side of jazz. But it's hard to call her a jazz singer because she was also a sound poet. She incorporated movement, aesthetics of dance and fluxus practice in her own work. She was connected to people like Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles. She's very much a part of that scene, as Eastman was. And what they both did, and what Julie Lee did with the, I mean, it goes beyond language as we understand it. And that's why, and it's something that I tend to do, where words aren't enough to express, so you then use other things. The vocal expression comes through the physical action of what the body's doing. So something that I'm interested in, and which I tried in Sweet Tooth, was to extend the voice through movement. So gesture is vocal. A physical gesture is the voice. A movement across the space is the voice. A sound, the sound or an object can become part of the voice depending on what I choose to do with it. And that extends the idea of what a voice could sound like. Also, it challenges the notions of what a singer is supposed to be and to do. And in their work, in Eastman's work and in Jeannie Lee's work, they're constantly challenging the notions for a listener what a vocalist is supposed to do and how you're supposed to sound. But actually what it is, there's something, when I use the word primeval, it's kind of, it comes back to first utterance. The first sounds, what's that sound like? What is that? And what is a future sound? What do future voices sound like? How's the voice? And exploring these aspects. And you can't use words. Words button you up. They kind of, they restrict you. They can be very restrictive, which is why in Eastman's work, when he's working with the kind of in a more graphic way or asking for these textures, it's not words aren't enough. And he's challenging also the vocalist to allow that expression and to surprise themselves, to see what else they can engage with, to elevate the experience. And it also elevates the listening experience. John was talking about hearing and listening. Well, it is a level of deep listening that is required. And it's a deep listening practice for the performer, but also for those who are listening as audience. I have a real problem with the word audience, because it then, you know, we're not kind of doing 5, 6, 7, 8, you know, and that's fine. There's a place for that kind of performance and entertainment. But this is a much deeper experience that is hopefully life enhancing and life transforming, and people you're going to wrestle with things. Wrestle with what you have just experienced, what you have just heard, I guess, what you've just listened to. And where does that take you? So it's Eastman is asking for something far more enriching. And words, people said, why do you do this with words? I said, because words aren't enough. You know, I'm lost for words. So I work with the sounds, or the expression or the meaning of a word, and use that as the springboard for vocal expression. And in Sweet Tooth, that's what I did, because the horror of the Atlantic slave trade can't just be expressed with words, because there is something that is continued, that is passed on from generation to generation in terms of the expression of that horror and the anger behind it, and the calling out, and that has to be vocalized in a way that words really simply aren't enough.
I feel like I have to bring clearly to the surface now the kind of psychoanalytical registers of many of these conversations, because one thing I think about when, you know, I'm thinking about watching in the key of listening is the kind of psychoanalytical, you know, setup, the situation of which Freud can't help but resort to a visual kind of analogy, looking down the microscope or whatever. Yet, you know, there is this talking that, you know, that is the talking cure, which is going on, and of course with Eastman, you know, the repetition and the compression of time and the over-determination of time and experience that is coming out in this panel discussion. I think thinking about some of the things we've done together, Elaine, over the years, I think there is something in like being on the edge of language and also with repetition and even some of the kind of structural stages and setups that you know you've done in your work, we've done in some of our collaborations. I think, you know, you're almost, you know, in the same way the psychoanalytical thing is, you know, you stage a situation to allow things to come out, you know, and I think that's kind of what we're talking about, is a bit, isn't it? Like, you know, setting up a situation that is, you know, going to be the best kind of environment for these, you know, things just to come out, and they're not going to necessarily come out in the right order, or but, you know, or your proximity to it, these things might not always be consistent.
Well, yes, there is that. There's also allowing for that space for and allowing for, you can't control everything. You know, composers try to control a lot of things, which is why, you know, I find Eastman really interesting, because he's asking for exactness. He knows what that feels like, but he also wants people to be free as well and to experience. And I was just thinking about Joy Boy that was performed last week, because I've never performed that before, and I was a little bit stressed about it, because I just thought, well, I you know, I don't know if I can do this, but it was such an exciting experience for me, because it felt like it was like a spider's web, and whatever we changed, we moved from one chord, it triggered something else, and there was this shimmering. It's just such a brilliant piece. It's such a brilliant piece to perform. It's hypnotic as well, but you have to give yourself, I was asking, you have to give yourself over to it.
You kept saying after students, you
resist it. If you resist it, trust. Yeah, you have to give yourself over. You have to trust. You have to trust what he has asked you to do. If you can't do that, then you shouldn't be performing. You can question,
and the timing helps.
You can question, but the time is, yeah. I mean, those doses, but you obviously question. You wrestle with things. There's some things you don't like doing, if you know, but you do need to trust. And even if something earlier, Sam, you're talking about, I think it was you, and talking about in Stay On It, or where things fall apart. Well, they don't really fall apart. They're on the edge of falling apart. Yeah. And when you're performing it, you think, oh no, this is all going to fall. Oh no, no, slow motion. It's like this kind of weird car crash. No, and you just hope that no one's going to stop. And then somehow it comes out of it, and the theme comes back. And you're like, how did that happen? How did that happen? And I think it's so clever, and it's so brilliant, because when it does, you physically feel that it's just this release, and that's the genius of it, you know. But those situations, that can, I think that he's been able to make that work because he knows what it feels like. He knew what it would feel. He knows what it feels like. So he's drawing on that experience and pushing on that. Because he knows that classical players are going to really kind of stress themselves out. And it's kind of really challenging those notions. And that's what's so brilliant about it. Yeah.
Koja, I wanted to come back to something you were saying about the soundtrack, and so I don't mean to paraphrase at all, but so when you were talking about that, I was thinking about some of the kind of, you know, classic kind of analyses like by Shion and other people about, you know, where is the soundtrack in relationship to the, you know, the narrative, and one thing that strikes me about the third part of the third measure is that you know, the two cameras opens it up and unfolds the space of the film to an extent where there's less opportunity for the kind of acousmatic or things that are actually not seen, you know, or not within the space of the performers. So and I think that as you were talking, I was thinking about that aspect of the installation, that you know, you don't actually feel there's very much outside the locus of what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an experiment in what Shion calls syncresis.
Yeah,
it's even more an experiment in what what the history of soundtrack and sound design calls Mickey Mousing.
Oh, what's that?
Mickey Mousing is, and I think all of the racial connotations of Mickey Mouse are intended. It's when you have animation and every gesture is sonically indexed. So when Mickey Mouse hits somebody, you hear a sound like donk, or when Mickey Mouse pushes somebody, you hear the sound. It's the indexing of every single sound. It's the matching. It's the kind of redundance increases. And, you know, in the kind of tradition of moving image that we position ourselves in, or that we draw on, that kind of, you know, the kind of essayistic mode, that's a real anathema. You know, the idea is you work on the differentiation and divergence of sound and image. That sound never underlines image. Sound is never redundant to image. They have their autonomy. And in this project, the experiment was the reverse. It was to match as closely as possible. The beauty of it was that once you do this, you realize that syncresis is actually impossible. The Mickey Mousing doesn't actually exist. Like, there are moments when, despite matching every shot with every sound, you still can't tell what sound is coming from what fingers. In fact, there are many moments where you can't quite match image to sound, despite every image being matched to every sound, and vice versa. And so that's a very fascinating experiment for us. But it was also, it was a challenging one, because it means we kind of went against a kind of, you know, a kind of imperative that the kind of work we do almost makes as a categorical command, like you will not match sound and image, you know. So it's hard to know how much any of that emerges for people watching. But for us, that was one of the primary debates that we had. That means we had weeks of discussion, like weeks and weeks, many discussions over this question. So for us, it's a fundamental question. With Simon Arazi, the editor, you know, the three of us, Anjali, myself, Simon, talking. And so it's opening up this question of the kind of, you know, the kind of, it's this variation between the agency and mobility of forces and the entanglement and inextricability. It's the way things come together but do not meet. The way, no matter how much we try to make them meet, they converge, but they do not meet. You know, that's one of the outcomes that that we didn't know before we embarked on this experiment.
Well, one of the visitors actually this week was a 4-year-old girl, and she just shouted out in the middle. She was, "Why are there so many pianos, and why are there so many people on pianos?" And I was trying to think about an answer for her, and I said, well, you know, you can hear all those sounds, but you can actually see all of those things going on as well. Like, there's a lot compressed into one small kind of point of view. And I think she also thought it was quite romantic as well, like sitting together, and kind of all the bodies were quite kind of on top of each other as well, which I think plays into some of the things you're saying as well. But then there's that moment where you can't even keep up, even though you're actually seeing so and hearing so much.
Well, I mean, we enjoyed, that film Fantasia is, I kind of love the way that all those brooms begin to double. Yeah. And, all those kinds of reflections and everything begins to kind of take on a kind of animatory kind of excess. And for us, the black sheen of the piano, because, I want to go back to this idea I was talking about earlier, which underpins all of our work, which is around generative alienation, meaning that we do not want to produce any kind of thing in our work which is comfortable for institutions or people who get remedial effects out of working with Black or Asian artists. We want the work to completely unsettle those expectations, and we have always tried to think about the aesthetics of that and how to work with that. And the reason we chime with Elaine or with people or with somebody like Julius Eastman or with John Cherry is because they are doing the same thing. So I think that there's like a sense of wanting to kind of produce more out of that generative alienation. So it isn't a cacophony, but it is a polyphony. That speaks to that within it are many traces of other forms of other practices of generative alienation and other frequencies. And I think when people talk about the aesthetics of, when people talk about decolonization, and Elaine talked about things working with Eastman being hard work, I think for me, these things are links.
John.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to Mickey Mouse. And this is unfortunately going to geek out a little bit. But it does, when you look at that score for a third part of the third measure, one of the things that I got the impression of is that if this were shot analog, so that you had frames, you would be very close to a kind of Mickey Mousing of a very subtle sort, namely the pulses of the notes on the piano get up to the range of about 24 frames per second. And there's an interesting sense here in which part of the way the illusion, the cinematic illusion in the analog form of the medium operates is that a certain aspect of the medium has to fall out of human perception. And that strikes me as what's interesting too about the piece. I mean, there is, yes, they get tired, but the part of the exhaustion of it too is that you're creating this sequence of pulses, like in a very narrow span of like on a single key on the piano, so that you get these really interesting and provocative alignments of, so what's falling out or below? And it's happening on, the sonic as well as the visual level. And it just kept making me think that when we worry about sound and image, and we do so properly, I take all your points, Kanjo. It seems to me we don't want to narrow down too fast what the visual means here. And that there's something about what's going on there that is quite fascinating and feels to me as though it's part of the way, at least in this piece, Eastman is working his performers. The activity required for that is fascinating. I mean, it's not something you can sit still and listen to. You just can't. I can't. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Isaac, I think that I just recalled a section of your essay which is about the limitations of the piano as instrument. Like, I think something like, is it called the double escapement or something of the piano, which actually resists, to use this kind of psychoanalytical term, you know, there's a limit to actually what is possible, to say it in one way, which kind of connects to what John was saying, but also which the visual medium really kind of conjures.
I think on that point, so this was a concept that was shared with me from the musicologist, music theorist, Mark Hannaford at the University of Michigan. And I was trying to figure out, it was just coming off of the cusp of exploring John Cage's prepared pianos and thinking, well, you know what, the materiality of the instrument is not given. We can open it and pull at its viscera, and so I think that there was an experience of I think it was Gay Gorilla, and just seeing the way in which the keys were being attacked, that I wanted to think more about how the instrument itself, the physical instrument itself, would respond. And I think this aligns really really well with either Kojo or Anjali. I mentioned the sheen, the black sheen, but also this kind of black endlessness that we are thrown into as the framing scene of the film, and a rather intense set of shots of the hands, which for me makes me ask, who gets to perform this piece? What kinds of people are performing the piece? Which I think that it all presses up against not just the limit of the piano itself, but the limit of performance, limit of access to training, the limit of accepted participants in this music making scene, and there are ways in which the really intentional angles of shining back the reflection that comes off of these surfaces makes us think twice about how closed off those limits really are, and what different line, you know, thinking kind of Deleuzian here, you know, what different scenes of flight are possible, escape are possible in these frames.
And just for those visitors who might not be as familiar with these works, Evil N and some of these other works could actually be played by other instruments, but it's vital that it's the same instrument. So there's a doubling, a quadrupling, you know, a proliferation of the same instrument.
And you know, I also want to be considerate of time here, but I think that we should take Anjali's distinction, not cacophony, but polyphony, very seriously here, because Eastman, again, back to Elaine's point about working in the choir, being a singer, he is coming out of this vocal scene deeply invested in a gorgeous layering and sonic expanse of the polyphonic act. And I mean, this is this is quite manifest for me after just going to a concert of Machaut and De Vitry, but the ways in which an early modern insistence upon polyphony that is so other bodily, out of this world, you know, not at all interested in the flesh as it is here now, but thinking about different kinds of orientations to times not yet revealed, and think, think about that theologically aside, to have Eastman put these kinds of voices, these kind of phrases in Mackle, erotic sounds. I think that there's one line in Mackle, unexplainable noise, or something like that, laughter, shuffling. To have this be a part of the polyphonic call, I mean, come on, it's so exciting. It's so exciting, and it demands that we think more expansively and intentionally about what music and its movement across mediums invites us to conceptualize and affect in the world.
And this seems like a really good moment to bring up a quote that I had stuck to my desk from this morning, and in response to what you're saying there and what Anjali was saying. Roland Barthes, it's amazing, in an interview, a conversation with Roland Barthes, he said, at every moment of my life, wherever I go, even walking in the street, when I think, react, I constantly find myself on the side of thought that grapples with what is discontinuous and combinatory. Today, for example, I was reading a text by Brecht on Chinese painting, in which he says that Chinese painting puts things next to each other, side by side with each other. That's a very simple way of putting it, but very beautiful and quite true. And what I want, after all, is precisely to feel the juxtaposition of things, the next to. And when I was showing the installation and installing it with students, we were really aware and talking a lot about this idea of the next to. What happens when you have these two screens touching one another? And it's very important that kind of format. And also, the black and the white key and the kind of, the curvature of the two pianos kind of tucking into one another. I think, this really speaks to what Anjali's talking about something which is, has a polyphony, but, still, necessarily incorporates kind of like, difficult kind of relations and kind of differentials. I don't know whether that quote means anything to you, Anjali, but it definitely came up with me when I was watching the film again.
I mean, yes. I mean, there is a slight angle, right, to the screens, but I would say, and this angle is to kind of break with the panoramic, and to kind of, yes, just point to a kind of mirroring of the screens, for instance. So for example, one of the works I love in the world is Horchamp by Stan Douglas, where he has two screens in this very grey room. Used the room kind of highlights almost the colour of the faded footage of video, and George Lewis is playing, and it's a very evocative work. And then we were thinking a lot about why screens, because many artists love these giant multiple screen installations, and I kind of find it quite pointless, actually, unless there is an actual point. And I think for us, the rigor of somebody like Haroon Farocki's thinking around relations to screens has been quite helpful for Kojo and I. So Horchamp is like a single double-sided screen that you have to walk around. In this case, we wanted the two, because the pianists are facing each other across the pianos in order to make the sights. So they have sight lines in order to play the work, in order to count those sections. And so we didn't want two screens exactly facing each other, but we wanted to think about the kind of angular nature, which is also repeated in the makeup, which is a device that we used to, let's say, think about them as a group and as an ensemble, and to kind of let's say amplify that as an idea. And then the makeup also reflected the lighting rig, which was this kind of diamond-shaped object with LED lights that we positioned above the pianos, so the lights would hit all these different angles of the piano. Why did we do that? It was almost to look at how reflection and, well, I mean, again, we use the surface of the piano as a kind of reflecting device in order to think about how all the hands on the piano could also be reflected, and we needed to light that. So I think the installation was a series of repetitions as well. So we were thinking about the angular, the lighting, the makeup, the way that so everything came out of the work itself. Everything came out of the piece itself. It was as it was being designed and thought of. So the camera and the expression of its installation were all, I would say, interlinked with the piece as it was being performed. In relation to this question of the performers being mainly white and one being Asian, I mean, a question we had a lot was, well, in the US was number one, well, you're not black, how can you be part of the Otolith group? Or you're not black, how can you be, how come there's no black performers? How come you didn't find any Afro-diasporic, Afro-Caribbean pianists? And, you know, this is, you know, one knows how racist these classical music schools are in the UK as well as in the States. You know, I've known that for a long time. But you know, it was actually just difficult to find an ensemble or a group of people who could play Eastman and had been playing him for 2 years. In order to, I was quite open to the idea, if we'd had more money, of actually finding, you know, a series of piano players on the advice of friends, younger ones, older ones, intergenerational, and bringing them together, say, under the direction of somebody like Rolf Hines, in order to, you know, produce the piece. I have no problem with that, but it was just too expensive we didn't have much money to make this work. So to actually generate that would have been quite difficult, but maybe there is a way to continue to think about how that might be done. I think that's maybe another afterlife of this film. In relation to the work itself, though, I think Eastman, it's an angry, when you listen to it in the context of his defense of the titles, and the reason we put them, you know, back-ended and front-ended, I think there was a sense of like, you listen to Dante giving this, I mean, this was all completely improvised. We didn't tell Dante, we didn't really give them any guidelines, I don't think. We just said, read it as you feel it. And Dante has a register which is quite sort of, I would say, cool and to the point, and yeah. And then you listen to the work, and then you listen to Elaine, and Elaine's work, Elaine is almost mirroring the piece itself by producing all these different vocal registers in relation to the idea of the third part. It was like this moment, and you know, I watch people watching this work, and they're like, oh my God, there's the angry black woman on the screen screaming at us. And I'm like, yay, hurrah, you know, great. But yet but then it goes right back into this kind of different noise. I think the sense that I also think that the piece itself is a challenge to whiteness, is a challenge. It's like saying, come on, you will play this, your hands will be exhausted, your fingers, you know, will become like these biomorphic machines that are almost typing, you know, like in, there is something almost, I mean, I was watching this film on Charlie Chaplin, which is awful, by the way, but I was watching a lot of the kind of repetitions and miming that he was doing in silent film. And there is almost like something quite cartoon-like about the way that the fingers are being kind of almost pushed. So of course, John Carpenter's The Thing, and of course, is it Buñuel's Exterminating Angel, where the glove falls off the table and the hand starts crawling around, you know, comes to mind. So for me, the work is quite gothic and horrific as well, in the kind of rage, but it's, for me, a very sophisticated rage.
That brings me to what John was, one of John's first responses actually to when we were watching the film together, you know, pre-installation, was the sense of melodrama. I don't know whether that was the right word you used, John, but the like, you know, this kind of idea of the silent film, but the pianists kind of like going off the tracks, you know, alongside. Sorry to terribly paraphrase you, John, but this is one of your initial kind of responses.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has reiterated in one way or another what a brilliant poacher Eastman was. I mean, he could take little bits and pieces, entire traditions, and reassemble. And I kept thinking about the sort of the musical cliche, especially in silent cinema, when you'd have like a pianist accompanying, of the sort of sequences in melodramas of chasing the villain, or the villain snatching the treasure, or the black man about to approach the wrong person, often a white woman. There's something in it that captures that kind of evocative. I mean, it's not referential, but it kind of evokes this sense of, you know, where you've heard these kinds of sounds. Think about what sorts of cultural literacies are evoked in bringing these to bear in a piece of music. So I feel as though that's something that is also worked up in an interesting and very savvy way, very much in terms of what Anjali was just trying to say there about, you know, the way he's asking us to think about race. He's asking us to think about how white listening happens, what associations is it making, and how do you put those, how do you phrase them in a way where they exist, but they're sort of repurposed, they're redirected towards other kinds of ends. So yeah, I was thinking there was something interesting about the way he was mimicking a very particular style of representing threat.
I mean, I think related to that, there is the kind of the Manichaean drama of the black keys and the white keys. You know, when Roland Kirk says, you know, the mystery notes, the case of the mystery notes that have been stolen for years and years, and then blows a whistle, and then there's broken glass, and it's called Black Mystery Has Been Revealed. It's less than 1 minute. You know, it's an exquisite track with this flourish of strings, and then it just cuts. So that kind of racial Manichaean drama encoded and built into the piano once we made the decision to work with the 4 pianists that we'd seen at the London Contemporary Music Festival, then the die is cast for that kind of Manichaean drama to take its place on stage, or you could call it a Manichaean melodrama, to use John's phrase. And so then it's a question of, you know, you can't disavow that melodrama because it precedes us and it postdates us, and the work is taken up in the force of that Manichaean structure. And so the work is an exercise in 4K. Like in 2017, working in 4K digital high definition video was not as common as it is now. And this is one of the first works in which we do that. So the emphasis on the black lacquer of the piano, the dressing of the studio with blackout screen, and then so-called color grading in order to really alleviate or really blur the distinction between the black of the studio, the black roll neck sweaters that the pianists are wearing, and the black of the piano surface itself. The heightening of that in relation to the whiteness of the pianists themselves, all of that is entirely deliberate. All of that is us accentuating and dramatizing the this Manichaean structure built into the piano.
And the dynamic range of the 4K, is that what you're saying, enabled you to get more precision on that?
Yes, there's a performance lecture which we wrote called A Day of Grading and a Night of Correction in the Digital Universe of Color. And it's based on the color grading, or what is called color correction, which is a strange term.
In the book.
Yeah, exactly. And it's based on the grading of the third part of the third measure. So there is so you have the Kate, the director of photography. Kate who brought the 2 other women DPs. You have Kate, the director of photography. You have Simon, the editor. You have the color grader, and you have myself. And we're going through the video frame by frame, discussing it frame by frame. At a certain point, I realized everybody's got it covered. So instead of like butting in, I drop back and I start taking notes on what they're saying, on the kind of the language, which, and this is often quite typical for filmmaking, a language which is simultaneously technical, aesthetic, and racial. That's quite common to the history both of analog film and of digital film. For example, when they're talking about white skin, it's called pig skin. That's not my term. That's an industry term. Pig skin, they say that. So I wrote it down. Then they'll say things like, we have to crush the blacks. This is the color grader. He says this. And what he means is there is digital noise in the blackout screen. And what he means is we can use color grading technology to go into that noise and change it. We can change the temperature of color. That's what he means. And the whole afternoon, the whole day or 2 days is full of text and full of words like that. The technical, racial, aesthetic vocabulary of color correction, which
synesthetic.
Yes,
but also,
part of the language of the actual
the kind of
the grader, so crushing the blacks, and all these terms are, they're embedded into these into the relationship between shadow and light, and milkiness and pinkiness, and the idea of color correction, so loaded.
So these are all insider. This is insider lingo that people never see, but what you do see is the outcome of it. This highly polished, resolutely artificial, high definition, Manichaean melodrama, which is orchestrating bodies and surfaces in this structure of 3 and 2. So you have doubles and quadruplings and octuplings, but it's all structured via these 3 parts of like speech, music, speech, the third part of the third measure. So it's all of this 3 into 2 plus of all of this overload, this excessively polished veneer, excessively polished lacquer. So it should be, at a certain point, your eye is like, optically speaking, you start looking at it and you're like, all of this is deeply unreal. Like the piano's too black, the pianists are too white, the background is too black. I can't see, I can't really tell how large or how small the space is.
Yeah.
I can't really tell where it is happening at all. All those things give you this kind of, they set off this heightened agnosticism, which becomes part of the invitation of the work.
I think compression is something that's like, really a thread that's kind of gone through this whole session, different forms of compression, and visual, sonic, temporal. I think I actually, for the first time recently, I read David Borden's analysis of evil in the Gay Gorilla book, and he actually brings up this image of a kind of celestial orrery of this kind of spinning away from the tonal center of D minor. And but I was, as I was reading now, I was also thinking of like the censure pedal pull back, and I think this is another image of all these things that like want to pull apart but also are kind of tenuously held together as a way of trying to kind of bring some of these conversations together. But we need to kind of like feed ourselves and reflect and think. But this has been so wonderful already, and please to all the guests, and especially to those international. Please join us, in the second section, which will be 4:30, and we're going to bring into this universe Danveer Singh Brar, Nicholas Singh, and John is going to be taking up the mantle of chairing, which I'm really pleased about. But thank you, everybody, and especially thank you to Elaine, Isaac, Angelique, Kojo, and all the people who have contributed via questions and comments. So thank you all, and I'm just going to keep this running, and so it's the same link, and I will see you all this afternoon. Thank you very much.